Ever wondered how a pension gets split up in a divorce? Especially like when someone's close to retirement but not quite there yet.
Oh, yeah.
You're in for a treat today. We're diving into this 1992 Canadian case, Bias versus Bias, that's full of these, wait, what? Legal twists.
It really highlights how even seemingly straightforward concepts like property
Mm.
can become surprisingly complex during a divorce.
Right, you hear
This-
divorce and you think splitting furniture and stuff,
Right.
but this is next level stuff.
Yeah.
So picture this. Jean-Paul and Madeleine Blais, married in 1957, call it quits in 1985 after almost 30 years. He's worked at Inco, the mining company,
Hmm.
and she's been at the Sudbury Clinic and then Laurentian Hospital.
Okay.
Seems like a pretty standard scenario so far, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Deceptively standard. Because what's really at the heart of this case is how you divide assets specifically, Jean-Paul's pension, and a retirement incentive he might be eligible for.
Right.
When one spouse is on the verge of this, like big financial shift.
Okay, so before we even get to who gets what, I'm guessing there's some legal hurdle about what's actually considered fair game in a divorce, rightly? Like, can you really claim half of someone's pension if they haven't even retired yet?
You're spot on, and that's where Canadian law gets interesting. The legal definition of property in a divorce is broader than you might think. It's not just about what's sitting in your bank account on the day you decide to split.
Right.
It also includes things like the potential for future income, like that pension Jean-Paul was working towards.
Wow. So even if we hadn't seen a dime of that pension money yet, it still gets thrown into the mix.
Yep.
That seems kind of crazy.
It does make things tricky, right? And to add another layer of complexity, there's something called the valuation date, which is like the financial D-Day of the divorce. In this case, it was February 14th, 1985, Valentine's Day, of all days. Everything gets valued based on what it was worth on that specific day.
Okay. So let me guess. This valuation date is about to throw a wrench into things, especially with Jean-Paul's pension hanging in the balance. Am I right?
100%.
Okay.
Remember how Jean-Paul was close to that magic 30-year mark for a much bigger pension payout?
Right.
Well, on the valuation date, he was just shy of it. So how do you put a price tag on something that's still in flux? That's the million-dollar question, or should I say the pension pot question.
This is getting good. I'm on the edge of my seat here. So what happened? Did they somehow calculate what his pension would have been worth if he retired on that exact Valentine's Day?
Well, Madeleine's lawyer had a different idea altogether. An approach that sounds like it's straight out of a let's just wait and see playbook. But before we get into that, let's take a quick breather. We'll be back in a flash to unravel this pension predicament. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back. Last time we left off with Jean-Paul's pension hanging in the balance, all because of that pesky valuation date, right?
Yeah.
So tell me, what was Madeleine's lawyer's grand plan for tackling this? How do you even deal with that?
Well, they proposed something called the if and when method.
Okay.
Instead of trying to slap a price tag on Jean-Paul's pension on that specific Valentine's Day, they basically said, let's just wait and see how it plays out. Once Jean-Paul actually retires and starts getting those pension checks, then we can divide them fairly.
So they wanted to kick the can down the road and just deal with it later. I can see how that might make sense in this situation, especially since Jean-Paul was so close to retirement anyway. But, I mean, wouldn't that make things incredibly complicated, especially if one of them, well, you know.
Exactly.
Right.
You're thinking like a lawyer now.
Okay.
And the judge in this case had similar concerns. While they acknowledged that this if and when approach can be useful in some divorce cases, they ultimately decided against it.
Oh. Why is that?
Well, Canadian law specifically, the Family Law Act, really emphasizes a clean break whenever possible. And the judge felt that dragging out the pension division for years, maybe even decades, just wouldn't align with that principle. Plus, like you pointed out, there's always that added wrinkle of what happens if one spouse passes away during that waiting period.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. A clean break sounds much less messy, for sure. But if they couldn't use this if and when method, how on earth did they figure out how much Jean-Paul's pension was actually worth on the valuation day? It's not like they had a crystal ball, to see into the future.
You're right. No crystal ball involved.
Okay.
What they did was actually pretty interesting, though. They essentially pretended that Jean-Paul had retired on that valuation date, February 14th, 1985.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
So on that date, Jean-Paul had 29 years of service at Inco under his belt. Based on the company's collective bargaining agreement at the time, If he had retired right then and there, he would have been eligible for $551 a month.
Ah, so they used his potential early retirement benefit, basically, as a benchmark.
Exactly.
Clever.
And from there, they used that $551 monthly figure to calculate the present-day value of his entire pension as of,
No.
that valuation date.
Wow, that's pretty wild. It's like they created this whole hypothetical scenario just to figure out how to split things up. Talk about legal gymnastics.
But hold on a second. Didn't we also have that life insurance policy to factor in?
Well,
I bet that wasn't as straightforward as it seemed either, huh?
you know it. You're right. Jean-Paul did have a life insurance policy through Inco. And just like that pension, even something like life insurance gets put under the microscope in a divorce.
Right. And it all comes down to something called the cash surrender value.
Okay, I have to stop you right there. Cash surrender value. That sounds, I don't know, it sounds intriguing, but break it down for me. What exactly is that?
In simple terms, it's the amount of money Jean-Paul could have pocketed if he decided to cash out his policy on that. All-important valuation date.
Right.
Think of it like a savings component that's built into some life insurance policies.
Ah, okay. So they basically had to figure out how much his life insurance policy was worth on February 14th, 1985,
Yeah.
and add that to the pot of assets to be divided, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Hmm.
But here's where things get a little fuzzy. The source material we have for this case, it doesn't actually say what the cash surrender value was on that specific date.
You're kidding?
Yeah,
So they were working with incomplete information.
it happens.
How can a judge make a decision about something as important as this without knowing all the facts?
You've hit on a really crucial point. In a perfect world, we'd have all the information neatly laid out for us.
Right.
But in reality, legal cases often involve, a degree of uncertainty.
Right.
Sometimes you have to work with the information you have,
Yeah.
even if it's incomplete.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder if those missing details, might have changed the outcome, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of the missing details, what about that early retirement incentive that Jean-Paul was offered? Did they just sweep that under the rug?
Not so fast. Remember, we're talking about a time when Inca was trying to slim down its workforce, and they were offering employees like Jean-Paul, who'd been around for quite a while, a financial incentive to retire early. Madeline's lawyer argued that this incentive should be considered a shared asset.
Well, yeah, it sounds like a pretty sweet deal. If it happened during their marriage, shouldn't Madeline get a piece of that pie?
It seems logical, right? But the judge didn't see it that way. To understand why, we need to take a detour to another fascinating case, Gasparetto v. Gasparetto. Because the judge, in this case, saw some striking similarities.
Hold on, another case. This is getting even juicier than I expected. So what's the Gasparetto case all about? And how does it connect back to Jean-Paul and Madeline's, saga?
Okay, so in Gasparetto, you had a husband who was a teacher at a Department of National Defense school. He was thinking about taking early retirement, right? And he might have qualified for a similar incentive program. But there were a couple of key differences.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Firstly, the decision of whether or not to actually grant this incentive rested entirely with the Department of National Defense. So it wasn't a sure thing, you see. Unlike, Jean-Paul's situation, where Inco was, actively offering it to certain employees.
So it's like a maybe you will, maybe you won't kind of deal. That's a bit of a gamble, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's important because, it speaks to whether or not this incentive could be considered like a guaranteed or even probable future benefit.
Right.
And there's another important distinction.
Hit me with it.
The program in the Gasparetto case was totally unfunded. So neither the husband nor his employer was paying into it, which meant it could potentially disappear at any moment, like a mirage in the desert.
Oh, wow. So it was like a pretty risky proposition. I can see why that would make a big difference in how it's viewed legally.
Right. And because of that uncertainty, the judge in Gasparetto decided that it couldn't be treated as a, vested or contingent interest, meaning it wasn't something you could automatically, divide up in a divorce.
Okay. So circling back to Jean-Paul and Madeline, are you saying the judge saw their situation as being similar to this Gasparetto case, even though Jean-Paul's incentive wasn't as, iffy?
Precisely. Even though Jean-Paul's incentive was, more concrete,
Yeah.
it still wasn't a done deal on that all-important valuation date. He could have been hit by a bus the next day, Life is unpredictable.
What a bit, but true.
The point is, because he wasn't entitled to that incentive on the valuation date, legally speaking, it wasn't considered a shared asset to be divided.
Wow, this whole valuation date thing is really throwing a wrench into things, isn't it? You'd think that, what happened during the marriage, especially when it comes to finances, would be fair game. But it's not that simple.
It's not, is it? And that's what makes this case, and others like it, so fascinating.
Right.
It really forces us to grapple with these complex questions of fairness and how we apply legal principles to, real-life situations.
It definitely makes you stop and think, that's for sure. So, where does this leave us? What's the big takeaway? The lingering question that, bias v. bias leaves us with after all this legal wrangling.
Well, I think it challenges us to put on our judge hats for a moment
Okay.
and ask ourselves, if we would have ruled the same way,
Right.
what if you were in the judge's shoes looking at all the nuances of Jean-Paul and Madeline's situation?
Ooh, that is a good one. It's easy to get caught up in, the legal back and forth, but at the end of the day, it's about trying to find a solution that feels fair and just to, everyone involved.
Exactly. On the one hand, you have Jean-Paul, who was so close to hitting that 30-year pension mark.
Right.
It does seem a bit rough to just, disregard those potential future benefits, even if they weren't a sure thing on the valuation date.
Right.
But then again, Madeline had contributed to their life together for decades.
Right.
Don't you think she deserves some financial security, too? It's a tough call.
No easy answers, that's for sure. It's a good reminder that while laws provide a framework, applying them to, real human lives with all their messy complexities, it's rarely black and white.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, like in this case, you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, which, I don't know, just adds another layer of intrigue.
Absolutely. Bias v. bias reminds us that family law isn't just about, you know, dusty old rules and precedents. It's about real people, their intertwined lives,
Yeah.
and finding resolutions that, well, not always perfect,
Yeah.
feel as fair and equitable as possible.
Right.
It's about striking a delicate balance between legal principles and the realities of human relationships.
Well said. You've given us a lot to chew on today. Remember, if you are facing a legal issue, especially one with financial implications like this, it's always best to consult with a qualified professional who can, guide you through those murky waters.
Couldn't agree more. And who knows? Maybe your case will be the next bias v. bias, sparking fascinating legal discussions for years to come.
That's it for today's deep dive into the world of pensions, incentives, and the ever so important valuation date. Until next time, keep those legal questions coming.